Welcome everyone to the latest Bonner Institute webinar. I'd like to welcome you today to what I believe will be a crucial conversation about governance architecture that most boards are not yet having, but urgently need to do so. I'm John Barker at the Bonner Institute. I'm joined by the founder of the Bonner Institute, James Bonner, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Astrid Yee-Sobraquès. Astrid is a senior risk executive whose perspective on enterprise risk goes far beyond traditional risk management. Astrid has over 25 years at GE Capital, AIG, Citibank, and PwC. She has honed a rare breadth of expertise across enterprise risk management, strategic advisory, regulatory compliance, digital transformation, and cybersecurity across banking, asset management, and property and casualty insurance globally. Astrid is known as the Risk Sherpa, and she specializes in risk connectivity. And risk connectivity refers to integrating people, processes, and data to strengthen how organizations anticipate, manage, and respond to cascading risks. Astrid serves on the Global Association of Risk Professionals New York Chapter Advisory Committee. Just last month in October, she released the Connected Enterprise Framework, which is the first systematic approach to elevate enterprise risk management from a foundational discipline into the CEO's strategic intelligence engine. Our conversation today addresses something that's becoming painfully visible through recent high-profile failures, such as United Health's Change Healthcare incident and CrowdStrike's global outage, and Wells Fargo's persistent governance challenges. When these types of disruptions occur, the question is not just what went wrong, but did our governance architecture even allow us to see it coming? The issue is not whether you have risk, legal, compliance, and quality functions. You do. But the question instead is whether they're architected to work together when it matters most, and whether conflicts get resolved behind closed doors before reaching the board, leaving you with an incomplete picture of the strategic choices being made. What we're presenting today is a proposed governance architecture, a discussion framework for aligning these functions. Our goal is to surface the governance challenges you might not be seeing and offer mechanisms for consideration. Astrid, welcome. I'd like to begin with a question. Can you start by giving us some context? How exactly did we arrive at today's governance challenges?
So let me start with some context. The evolution of enterprise risk management over the past 25 years reveals how we arrived at today's challenges and why governance architecture is the solution. The development of ERM has been shaped by crises and market forces. Every major crisis triggered a regulatory response. Every regulatory response in turn empowered legal and compliance. And what started as strategic risk thinking, asking questions such as what can go wrong, how likely is it, what would be the impact, devolved into regulatory conformance, essentially asking the question, are we doing what the rule requires? The 2008 financial crisis was the inflection point. When regulatory action became the dominant concern, strategic risk-taking took second place behind regulatory risk avoidance, and risk management functions found themselves essentially subordinated to regulatory mandates rather than informing strategy. The fundamental questions changed from what risk should we take to what will keep us out of trouble. So what happened in practice is that functional mandate conflicts got resolved, or more likely buried, before reaching leadership. And this created fragmented intelligence, invisible trade-offs, and implicit risk appetite statements that govern decisions without explicit acknowledgement. So that's what I would say by way of context, John.
We know about the various functions, risk, legal, compliance, and quality. They all deal with risk. What exactly are the fundamental differences in what these functions do?
So let's establish what we are talking about. These four functions are by nature positioned very, very differently. Risk is forward-looking. It examines both upside and downside. Compliance, by contrast, is reactive and rule-based. Legal takes a defensive posture, while quality, by nature, again, embraces a preventative posture. So it follows that these four functions ask fundamentally different questions about the same risks or similar risks. Risk is going to ask about impact and likelihood. Legal will ask what the law requires and what our exposure is. Compliance is going to ask whether we're doing what the rule requires. And quality is asking whether what we're doing well consistently. So these are four different lenses that require different expertise, and from the get-go, should not really be overlapping too much. The reality says differently. So let me just give a critical example of why those distinct mandates matter. I'll take consumer protection and fair lending as examples here. Most organizations treat these things as standalone compliance programs, but think about what they actually represent. Consumer protection isn't a discrete risk type. It's the regulatory, reputational, operational, and strategic consequence of risks intersecting among product design, sales practices, complaints handling, data privacy, and third-party vendor. Similarly, fair lending is the regulatory and reputational consequence of credit underwriting, pricing model, marketing, and algorithmic bias risks. These are regulatory overlays on interconnected risk domains. And so when we treat them as standalone programs, we miss enterprise level cascades, we lose the risk-based prioritization, and we fail to integrate them into risk appetite and capital allocation decisions. And this fragmentation is precisely why aligned governance matters.
Mhm. So another question, Astrid. The regulatory environment is changing rapidly, in fact, daily. And there's even, for example, recent news in the European Union that GDPR and EU AI Act requirements might be relaxed in the supposed effort to make the European Union more competitive in AI. Can you give us an example of how organizations should think about these functions in this very dynamic regulatory environment that's changing rapidly?
So let's start with the most explicit example,
Mhm.
the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act. What the EU AI Act defines as quality management system is actually what mature enterprise risk management should look like. So look at this comparison on the slide here. The EU AI Act quality management system is not about operational quality in the traditional sense. Policies and procedures, model testing and validation, risk management throughout the AI lifecycle, documentation and records, post-market monitoring. These are components of a blueprint for what integrated risk management should look like. And this tells us something actually profound, that regulators have recognized that you cannot separate quality from risk management, and that these are the same question, just asked at a different altitude. And I think we'll answer more of your question as we go along, but first we need to take a little bit of um, a pause and take a look at some common conflicts between
Yes,
risk,
indeed.
legal, and compliance.
And that is actually a very interesting question because what do the different mandates in legal compliance, risk, and quality, where do they naturally create conflicts? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So I've taken four examples of conflicts where these functions naturally collide in real organizations. And before I walk through those conflicts, I just want to be clear that these conflicts are not the dysfunction. They're inherent to the different mandate, and that's a most important point to remember as we move forward with this talk. The dysfunction happens when organizations do not have mechanisms to resolve them. So let's walk through these four types of conflicts that every board should recognize. The first one is between the risk and compliance function. So picture this. Risk assesses control and says, we're spending $2 million annually to protect against a $200,000 risk. This doesn't make sense. Compliance might say, but the regulation requires this control. So here's the critical question. Does the expensive choice win by default, or does it win by strategy? And without a mechanism to surface this tension to leadership, organizations make an implicit strategic choice, and unfortunately, oftentimes it's the more expensive, risk-averse one, and leadership never sees really the trade-off that is being made. Conflict number two is between legal and compliance functions. So when regulations are ambiguous, as they often are, one function sees flexibility and the other sees enforcement risk. Legal might say, we have a defensible interpretation that allows us to proceed. Compliance, looking at recent enforcement trends, might say, we should apply the strictest possible reading of this regulation. Business opportunities get foreclosed without leadership seeing the strategic choice that's being made, and the organization become more conservative than its risk appetite could actually support, not by virtue of a board decision, but by default. Most important to remember for as we move forward with the talk. Conflict number three, again, is between risk and compliance functions. And this one is particularly insidious because, earlier we mentioned fair lending and consumer programs as examples. I'm going to take privacy here. Most organizations have privacy sitting in compliance, checking boxes on consent forms, managing GDPR requirements, maintaining breach notification templates, compliant tracks, whether the organization is meeting regulatory obligations. But when a privacy incident occurs, suddenly it becomes obvious this was never just a compliance domain. Risk is going to need to quantify the enterprise-wide exposure. If a vendor breach exposes customer data, for example, across multiple business lines, it's going to need to assess the reputational impact, even if the organization was technically compliant. Legal is going to need to assess the legal exposure, the litigation risks, and figure out how to manage privilege around our incident response. Quality is going to need to assess what process failures allowed for this incident to occur and how to prevent the recurrence of it in future. So no one really owns that enterprise view of how data security risk, vendor concentration risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk, legal liability intersect until something breaks and you realize that the handoffs between these functions were never really actually defined. The standalone programs missed that cascade. And this interconnection is precisely what enterprise risk management addresses through scenario analysis as a tool. It examines how risk cascade across domains. Effective ERM traces the pathway. Model risk triggers fair lending violations, which creates regulatory exposure, which amplifies reputational damage, which affects customer acquisition costs. That's not a compliance program. That's integrated risk assessment. So I believe these four examples of conflicts provide good context for circling back to the question you were asking a minute ago about the regulations and how the world is changing and how organization can adapt to them.
Well, in your opinion, Astrid, is anything forcing organizations to address this integrated approach?
So, okay, so something that I, probably could have mentioned earlier as well is organizations are caught between two legitimate fears, right? There is the inability to learn from failures if we're not documenting our risk incidents and analyzing causal chains and effects appropriately. or creating evidence that can be that can defeat us in court. Without clear protocols, organizations are often going to choose operational blindness over discovery risk. And so if we think about the Change Healthcare ransomware incidents from February 2024, which paralyzed healthcare payment systems nationwide, we can imagine what the internal tension across these three functions might have been. Risk would have wanted post-incident analysis. What went wrong? Why did controls fail? What's the systemic exposure across our vendor ecosystem? Legal might have been thinking, my gosh, every email, every Slack message, every root cause analysis document can potentially be discoverable in a class action lawsuit, and the regulatory investigations are coming our way. Compliance would have been caught in the middle with HIPAA breach notifications, which are mandatory, that demand documented timelines and root cause analyses, and being aware at the same time that overly detailed documentation creates that legal exposure, which legal precisely is concerned about. So these are not theoretical, discussions. They happen every time that these incidents occur in every boardroom dealing with the aftermath. And legal should worry about that discovery. It's their mandate. And that's not the dysfunction. But the dysfunction is the absence of a governance mechanism that lets leadership explicitly decide whether which risks they're more comfortable with, the discovery risk or the operational blindness that we just described. So this represents a strategic choice that organization must make about their risk appetite. And it's not a recommendation that I'm making that discovery risk be ignored, not at all, but it's a recognition that there's a trade-off that needs to be made.
So I'm curious, in practice, what does effective, successful alignment actually look like?
So I would like to review a little bit the regulatory environment before answering that question, John, if I may.
Mhm.
We've just reviewed some of these conflicts. You might think, okay, well, they exist, but we've managed them so far. They're not new, and that's true, they're not new. So why is this coming up now? And that's because the regulatory environment is changing, as you pointed out, John, earlier, and it's fundamentally changed. Regulators worldwide recognize that risks do not respect organizational boundaries and silos, and that effective risk management requires that integration by design, not coordination by exception. So let me show you what happened in just the last few years. I mentioned the EUA Act earlier, and I still believe it provides the clearest example because it mandates both a risk management system and the quality management system, and it explicitly requires them to be integrated. The quality management system contains, in fact, the risk management systems, which ensures that risk management happens consistently throughout the life cycle of a product or a service. But this sort of pattern, driven by regulators, extends far beyond AI, in my opinion. If we think back 15 years ago, the supervisory letter from the Federal Reserve Bank, SR 11.7, pioneered the concept that building models, validating models, and governing models must be integrated, a principle that's now more critical than ever in the AI and machine learning age. Now that these models proliferate more and more and get more and more complex as every day passes. DORA, and other examples that I want to highlight, explicitly requires financial institutions to break down silos between cybersecurity, operation resilience, digital resilience, and vendor compliance, risk management. So you cannot manage resilience with separate functions tracking separate metrics. There needs to be integration. Another example around operational resilience regulations, whether it's in the UK, the US, or Europe, really, those regulations require organizations to identify important business services, critical business functions, as it were, by combining operations expertise, risk quantification, legal interpretation, and business strategy. And no single function can answer that question without the others. Another example, third-party risk management guidance explicitly states that vendor selections requires procurement, risk assessment, legal contract review, and compliance monitoring, working in concert throughout the vendor lifecycle. So here's what's critical to understand. These regulations do not explicitly say risk, legal, and compliance and quality must work together. They don't mandate cross-functional committees. But instead, what they're doing is making it impossible for any one single function to comply alone. And so those regulations make integration structurally necessary, not just aspirationally good. And to comply, you will need to submit an operational resilience plan with all three functions contributing their expertise. To demonstrate DORA compliance, you'll need to share risk intelligence across functions. To validate AI models, you'll need risk assessments, legal review of regulatory scorecards, of standards, and compliance verification, all working in concert. So that regulatory design that's emerging eliminates the option of sequential handoffs and parallel work streams, and the regulatory design forces integration by making it impossible to comply otherwise. So here's the question that should concern every board, and I'm asking specifically about the EU AI Act and quality for a precise reason. If your regulator required an EU AI Act style integrated risk management system tomorrow for your core business, not just for artificial intelligence, for the core business, could you demonstrate that risk, quality, compliance, and legal functions actually work together? Or would it expose that integration is aspirational rather than operational? And I'm asking about quality specifically because boards do not think quality as a governance concern. They think about it as an operational concern. And when they think about it like that it belongs somewhere else in the production process, then, it's causing a moment of fuzziness here in our newfound regulatory regime. So the EU AI Act elevates quality management to the same governance level as risk management and makes them explicitly interdependent. And this is a test of whether your integration of strategic governance is real. If a regulator said, show me your overarching quality management system. Show me that it ensures that both compliance and risk management, interact throughout the product lifecycle. Could you produce it? Or would it, in fact, expose that risk does the risk assessment, quality does their process improvements, compliance does their monitoring, legal does their review, but nobody owns the integrated view and that the regulators are expecting? That's not a hypothetical question. It's very real. And it's increasingly what regulators in every jurisdiction are looking for and calling it resilience, whether it's operational resilience or digital resilience or model risk management or third-party risk management, depending on the domain and their focus area. But the label changes, but the requirement for demonstrated integration does not. It leads to the same thing.
So I'm curious if you are a chief legal officer, a chief compliance officer, a chief risk officer, and you realize that you don't have this convergence, you don't have the integration. How do you engage the board? What should the board's role be in all of this? And how do you engage the board? Because it cannot be fixed from the middle of the organization. It has to be addressed at the board level.
Absolutely. So before we get to the board role, I think there's four components of alignment, vectors of alignment, or components that enable alignment that I would like to highlight. The first one I think that we've talked about extensively is the contribution clarity. If we understand what each function brings to the table, then we have clarity about what each contributes by way of expertise. And so there's no need for additional coordinators to foster that alignment or committees. It's not about that. It's really surfacing those disagreements and escalating them with clarity to the board and moving forward confidently with these agreements. So again, I've said this before, and it's most important to understand, disagreement is not a bad thing. It's actually a very, very good thing, and is going to allow boards, C-suite, to make better informed decision if they understand exactly the three perspectives, right? So that's contribution clarity. Intelligence sharing underpins this. Again, it's not about creating more meetings. It's about having a combined data set that creates a single source of truth for enterprise risk. And the result of that is less redundant analysis, less redundant reporting, as it were, from these functions to the board, faster escalation, and the ability for the organization to see around the corners rather than being blindsided. The third component to that is the decision, what I call the decision hub. So when the nexus disagrees, right, risk, legal, compliance have different perspectives on a risk, we escalate. We don't negotiate between ourselves, right? There is tremendous value in that disagreement in the three perspectives. So we don't want to negotiate that disagreement away. It's going to be serving the role of forcing strategic risk appetite decisions to the surface. That's the value. And automatic escalation occurs with all three perspectives thoroughly documented. Leadership gets to see, for example, that risk management says, well, this is a medium risk. Well, compliance might say, well, we've got regulatory ambiguity here. Better, strictly adhere to the spirit and letter. And legal might just be more comfortable because they actually think that they have a defensible position. So it's about making an explicit risk appetite decision rather than letting one function risk aversion become the de facto strategy. And then lastly, the fourth block, the fourth component, sort of enabling better board governance here, or helping the board discharge their responsibilities in terms of oversight for good risk management, is documentation. And admittedly, this is the hardest challenge to solve for reasons that we mentioned before. Legal fears discovery and risk management is going to need transparency. So the key insight here is that leadership will have to decide whether their fear of litigation exposure outweighs the cost of operational blindness. High-performing organizations recognize this discovery risk exists. Certainly are not going to ignore that fact. But so does the risk of organizational amnesia. And this represents a strategic choice organizations can make about their risk appetite. Again, I'm not recommending that we ignore discovery risk. It's about recognizing that there's a trade-off to be weighed, and that's an aspect of risk appetite. And I'm not sure organizations always willfully have awareness of that. So why does it matter? Beyond good, governance, hygiene, there are three reasons for that. Competitive advantage is the first one. Organizations that resolve these conflicts explicitly, rather than by default, will make faster, better decisions. And high-performing organizations escalate, decide, and move. Speed is part of the strategy. Second is regulatory resilience. When your regulator arrives, they will not ask whether you have a risk function or a compliance function. They're going to ask whether you can show them if you've identified, assessed, and mitigated your risks across your organization. If risk is assessed one way and compliance monitors it differently and legal documents it minimally, you don't really have an integrated view of what to present. You have gaps that examiners can exploit. And that leads us to the third point about institutional knowledge. Organizations that cannot learn from their failures because legal fears documentation, cannot take calculated risks because compliance demands zero tolerance, these organizations get less intelligent over time. So there's a real trade-off here to be understood and taken on board. So this is about whether your governance architecture enables strategic agility or creates strategic paralysis. And that brings us to, John, your question about the role of the board, because this cannot be fixed from the middle of the organization. It requires governance architecture from the top. And my view is that the board's job, being, accountable and responsible for risk oversight, is to establish governance mechanisms that make the alignment operational and the conflicts explicit. So boards are faced with a very tangible risk of information asymmetry. Let's put together, governance architecture that allows them to get the best information possible that's available at the time to make the most informed decisions possible in the context. And I'll tell you, I'll share with you, some years ago, one of my chief risk officers told me that he was acutely aware of the fact that the board member who specialized in risk management was the person who actually decided whether he was keeping his job. It was not his reporting line. It was the board member. So it's not an official, sort of reporting line, but it's the reality of how oversight is performed, right? That's the reality. Board members with expertise in these domains really shape how functional leaders think and act. So the question is not about, whether the board has influence. It has influence. And that influence flows through explicit governance mechanisms or through informal relationships. And so what I'm proposing here is that for mature risk oversight, the next frontier for board is to ensure that these functions, risk, legal, and compliance, truly are integrated. And for boards that are still building risk governance capabilities, the 5 mechanisms that we have on this page here provide a roadmap for what mature oversight looks like. So again, we're solving for receiving separate reports from risk, compliance, and legal with different formats, different narratives. We're solving for the board's ability to see whether these functions disagree before those disagreements gets resolved or buried before reaching the board. And we're solving for whether this alignment is real or cosmetic. Mechanism number 1 is as follows. For each major enterprise risk, here I'm talking about the top risk, but conceivably you could go beyond. For each major enterprise risk, the board could require one integrated perspective showing how risk, legal, and compliance, quality being embedded now in risk, as we know, and legal and compliance, how each of these functions assess that enterprise risk and includes a discussion of where they disagree and why. Okay? The second protocol that I'm advocating is establishing escalation protocols. So requiring that each fundamental disagreement that the strategic governance nexus is faced with on major decisions is escalated to the board with all perspectives documented. The value, again, as we mentioned before, is in the disagreement itself. That's where the information lies for good decision making. The third mechanism is about conducting alignment stress tests. Stress test is a big word. You'll understand here what I mean by that. The board could ask scenario-based questions that require integrated questions. For example, the board might ask the C-suite, if we had a major cyber incident tomorrow, walk me through the decision-making process. Who decides, what gets disclosed, and when? And if legal says, well, we want to minimize documentation, but risk says we need a full post-mortem analysis, who makes the decision? Who decides? Who wins, right? The fourth mechanism is about reviewing risk appetite implementation. The role of the board here is not merely to approve a risk appetite statement that was developed by risk management, is to verify that it's actually being used. So when legal recommends against something and risk says it's within appetite, what happens? Does the stated risk appetite drive the decisions, or does legal conservatism serve as the de facto strategy or risk appetite? And then lastly, the fifth mechanism is requiring that single source of truth data set that we mentioned earlier. Those three functions, risk, legal, and compliance, should operate from shared risk data and intelligence, not separate risk registers, no information silos. And here's a diagnostic question that boards could be using to reveal the state of play, so to speak. Show me a recent example where risk, legal, and compliance disagreed on a major decision. How was it resolved and who decided? And if boards cannot get a clear answer to this question, or if the answer is we never disagree, then you have a governance gap that needs to be addressed. Here are 5 simple mechanisms that I believe could be of great assistance in resolving some of the information asymmetry boards are faced with, in providing oversight to their companies and assist in operationalizing that alignment between legal risk and compliance.
We invite all of our webinar participants to make comments. You can unmute and give them verbally, or you can put them in the chat feature. Comments or questions are absolutely welcome. Astrid, thanks for all of the insights. I do have some additional questions. I'd like to probe a little deeper into the risk appetite. So some guidance distinguishes between risk tolerance at the board level and risk appetite at the board level. Do you see any relevance in distinguishing between those, or do you think risk appetite covers all? So I literally have seen in some of the frameworks a distinction between appetite and tolerance, but I find it difficult to understand that distinction.
So that's a good question. I even speak about risk capacity. I think depending on the organization, we might have slightly different definitions. I think broadly speaking, they would be the same thing. If we want to get very technical, they correspond to different things. So risk appetite is going to be the amount of risk that the organization is willing to take on, in the pursuit of their strategic objectives. Tolerances or limits are going to be sort of the allocation of that appetite, if you will, into subcomponents of that. And oftentimes it's done by risk types. I have a whole, article being published on the topic coming up in December. I'm not a huge fan of this approach for the reason that we discussed earlier in this webinar. It fails to capture the risk cascade. I'm much more interested in what I call the enterprise risk, appetite, which is looking at our appetite defined on a suite of scenarios that look at the pathways of where risk it originated and the domino effect across other risk categories. And then risk capacity is essentially a consumption of that, right? So our risk appetite might be a big number. How much of that we consume through losses that we experience throughout the day is a metric that allows us to see how close we get to that appetite. What sort of risks are surfacing? Is that what we expected to see, or did we miss a mark? And oftentimes this is related to decisions or discussions about capital, which is another aspect of a very core and fundamental aspect of enterprise risk management. I'd be delighted to talk about that in greater detail some other time. But so broadly speaking, the same thing. Operationally and technically a little bit different, and speaking to different aspects of how well we measure our risk management activities or risk-taking activities.
So another question I have, and by the way, again, if any member of our audience has a question or comment, please interrupt me. Some organizations, there's certainly a trend in some organizations in order to cut costs. They're actually not having a separate compliance officer role, but instead they're consolidating the chief compliance officer role with the chief legal officer role. The United States Department of Justice does not prohibit that, but it does strongly discourage having a combined chief legal officer and chief compliance officer role. So if you are in such an organization and you need to engage the board, what advice would you give an organization that is considering consolidating chief legal officer and chief compliance officer roles?
So for further background, John, I understand you said it's not prohibited, but discouraged. What's the
Yes.
premise for that?
Well, the DOJ has not specifically addressed why it's discouraged, but there is one glaring issue, and that is the issue of attorney-client privilege and the work product doctrine, which goes to the heart of what you've
Yep.
presented today.
Yep.
And so, traditionally, certainly in more mature organizations, larger organizations, the chief compliance officer really should have authority to hire independent legal counsel because there might be a compliance problem in the legal department. The
Yep.
compliance officer needs direct access to the board. And the compliance officer needs the ability to launch investigations independently of the legal department. So those are some of the
Yep.
background issues, but it is a fact. And I certainly see, in my LinkedIn feed, I will see job titles, chief legal officer and chief compliance officer.
Yep.
So it's definitely a trend.
I think so. The answer is going to be complex, and I'm gonna add a twist to that. It's going to differ based on the size of the organization.
Yeah.
Large corporations will have separate roles for all three things: legal, risk, and compliance. Small organizations, I agree, will tend to combine legal and compliance, which may create the conflicts that you just expounded on.
Yeah.
It speaks to something very important that I have not explicitly addressed, but runs through, this discussion. The role of legal is counsel, not decision maker. Counsel. There are advisors. And for reasons that you said, when something does occur in an organization and investigations are required of an ethical or a legal nature, they have to be able to, without being tainted by any sort of relationship, do their investigation and document the reports up to the board accordingly with the privilege that ensues. I have personally questioned more the need for a separation between a chief risk officer and a chief compliance officer. And I do believe the regulatory environment is what led to the separation of these two roles because of the sheer magnitude of the volume of work involved, right, in answering requests from regulators and rating agencies and shareholders and so on and so forth. But compliance, to me, is an overlay. Compliance per se is not a risk. We have a compliance issue when something else has occurred. The risk root cause is really what we should be tackling, not looking at it from the lens of compliance, but looking at it from what was the root cause, the origination point
Mhm.
of that risk that then materialized, manifested, and resulted into a compliance issue. It's a mapping thing, right? We should be looking at the root cause, not as a consequence when we do the analysis. It flows from root cause to consequence, not consequence to root cause. Hopefully that made sense. Um, and I think that, again, that speaks to those are very different mandates. And do we need, is, do we have enough confidence in our strategic risk thinking ability enough that we can combine, say, a chief risk officer and a chief compliance role? That we know that by doing sound risk management, which, by the way, in my view, is nothing but really good business management, that we will then be compliant with our rules and regulations. I think that people in what we call the first line of defense should be most cognizant with the rules and regulations that an organization has to comply with. Do we need a separate organization, a separate functions to keep track of
Mhm.
those for us?
Mhm.
Perhaps perhaps a slim one, right? Just for interpretation purposes, for guidance, for as advisors to first line. Does it need to be a full-fledged, three-tier organization? Not so sure. So it's a valid question. I think a lot of it has to do with the size of the organization and the risk culture. And the risk culture being, again, underpinning all that we said this morning, whether boards and C-suite are inherently risk averse. And sometimes, unfortunately, also it is convenient, right? If we can't document things, we're protecting from legal risk, but it also allows us to not address organizational sins, right? So those choices speak a lot about culture and risk appetite implicitly from a certain point of view, as well as market positioning.
Mhm. Well, I have a very concrete example. Um, oh, Maman Ibrahim has a question. The question, it's in the chat feature. How do you ensure that disagreements between legal, risk, and compliance escalate early enough to inform risk appetite decisions instead of being negotiated away at operational levels?
Yeah. So um, that's an excellent question. We have an annual process oftentimes for setting risk appetite. I think that's not enough. I think throughout the year, when major decisions occur and those disagreements surface in the process of working through those major decisions or major problems, those should be brought to the board in real time, right? Or whatever cadence boards meet, and they meet more than once a year. So it may not have been explicitly captured in your risk appetite, but that's something that needs to be surfaced. And once understood, can be sort of addressed in the sets of risk appetite statements that have been created earlier. We make amendments to risk appetite throughout the year as warranted by change in risk profiles. So it's we're talking here to an audience of purposeful leaders.
Hmm.
This is assuming that we have healthy corporate cultures with,
Hmm.
competent people in their roles. We're not
Hmm.
escalating silly
Hmm.
questions. We're escalating serious issues. Um, and we are genuinely interested in informing our leaders, whether it's the C-suite or the boards, with the best possible information so that they can play their parts and make the good decisions, the best possible decisions given the circumstances, and provide oversight and give us guidance in turn. So
Hmm.
it's not a one-way street. It really is. It's a system, and it should be a healthy system of ongoing dialogue.
Hmm.
Boards and C-suite should have the expectation of us, in the middle of the organization, providing them with the best possible information so that they can weigh, risks appropriately. And I understand no information is ever perfect, but we can get them better information and then move forward with those decisions. And we learn from our mistakes. Should mistakes occur, that's unavoidable. There is no such thing as risk zero. No such
So,
thing.
so I have actually two questions. So the first question I had asked earlier, but I'd like to ask it again. So let's say that you are a chief compliance officer or a chief risk officer or a chief quality officer, and you you have tenuous, irregular access to the board, and you realize that your board does not have this integrated view, and you realize the value in your role of that integrated view. Perhaps your fellow corporate officers do not. How do you get started practically to come to this convergence?
So it's going to be difficult without the willingness of our leadership to engage in good, robust risk dialogue. I would argue, though, that the five mechanisms I've presented here for board
Hmm.
governance can actually be replicated in a risk committee that has delegated authority from the board and delegated down, right, to other committees that CROs, chief compliance officers and whatnot may have in place themselves for their own, operations. So that would be a place to start. Um, I am a big proponent of having uncomfortable discussions. That's a key aspect of us as risk managers being able to manage risks in the firm. Concerns must be elevated, and that's
Mhm.
true of any level of organization. And that information should be moving up the food chain without being filtered out. I realized there's a little chicken and egg there, right? Because
Mm.
it has a lot to do with culture and how healthy or unhealthy it is. Um, if you are in a senior role, you will likely have the opportunity to build informal relationships with some of the board members. That's one way of passing the feedback. Um, but really, ultimately, informal relationships are good. They can be helpful, but in a weak risk culture can also backfire tremendously. So
Mm.
having that proper tone at the top, and the top really begins with board of directors and C-suite, and cascade down those mechanisms, that's the way to go. You can make the suggestions, you should raise it. In your day-to-day interactions and collaborations with compliance and legal, you should make every attempt
Mhm.
at collecting everybody's thinking and asking for their data sets and sharing your information with them.
Mhm.
Ultimately, this will need to be driven by the top. There's no question about it. Culture is driven by the top, not so much from bottom up.
I fully agree. Um, I have encountered boards, and I certainly have colleagues who have encountered boards that either do not have the knowledge, they've never been onboarded in risk management, they don't understand the compliance and risk management functions. And what do you do when your board does not have the knowledge? How do you get started? I
Gee.
know it's a difficult question, but it's actually quite practical. Yeah.
And you're asking the question from the point of view of someone who is in such an organization?
Yes, yes. So if I'm in the organization and I need to engage the board. I need the board to set a risk appetite. I need the board to help me set escalation criteria. How do I get started in engaging the board?
So you're
Correct.
in the C-suite then because you're interacting with the board, right?
Yeah.
So um, here's my approach. Whenever I give over my work, there's an education component to that. Um, I explain to people where I come from. I tell the story of how I landed on a particular conclusion or a recommended set of a course of action.
Hmm.
I have found that this teaching approach goes a long way in bringing people along and persuading them over to um, but to buy in, right? To buy in into what I'm suggesting needs to do. I consider my role not only to be managing risk, but also advising my fellow, senior leaders and the board on what should be done and what should be considered. Again, it's making good information available. After that, you cannot do people's roles for them, but you need to give them every opportunity to make the best decision possible. So education, explanation, advising, as opposed in addition to doing the day-to-day management of risk, goes a
Hmm.
long way. There's also processes outside of the risk, management sort of channel or, a compliance channel. Um, perhaps those annual surveys, organizational surveys that we do where you might be able to make recommendations that allows you to do so in an anonymous way if that's a concern. I would reach out, to board members, and share concern.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
A number of us, working with C-suite and boards, also, bring up these topics, recommend that it be addressed through training. So there are different channels and different groups of stakeholders, I think encouraging those discussions, in this education. It's not, you shouldn't feel alone, inside an organization, but I can see how that would be a little distressing. Wanting guidance and feeling that it's not coming from the top for lack of, education. And it's certainly difficult, to make good decisions without the proper background.
So we've reached the end of our hour. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask our audience, do you have any comments or questions and feedback for us from our webinar today? Did you get value from this webinar, insights from this webinar? We'd love to hear.
And I'll be very happy, by the way, John, to answer further question offline if some of the audience had additional questions they wanted to ask.
So, Astrid, if you're comfortable, can you put your email address perhaps in the chat feature for everyone or your LinkedIn? Maybe people will be interested.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out to me over LinkedIn. Here's my email address as well. Here we go, in the chat box.
And Jerry has asked, will the slide deck be available?
I can make it available.
Okay.
Either I'll email it to people or I'll put it on LinkedIn. We'll see. I'll give it a time.
Okay, absolutely. Well, this has been a fantastic webinar. And Astrid, thank you very much. I hope you'll do many more webinars at the Bonner Institute.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my great pleasure indeed.
Thank you for being here today.